Hello, and you are listening to Squash Radio. This is a brand new podcast that wants to bring the inside of squash to life by serving up the best stories. We are launching this channel with some in-depth interviews with some great people from the squash world. But we're also trying a little experiment first by doing two versions of each interview. One is the full-length interview that Squash Radio had with each guest, and two is a more produced version that takes some of the highlights from each conversation. Making those cuts is actually pretty challenging since we think it's all great content. But let us know what you think. Should we continue to do both? Send us an email to squashradio@gmail.com. Also, if you have any great stories that involve squash, let us know. We'd love to hear from you. We hope you enjoyed today's episode, and thank you for listening. What about this?
This call is...
Hey there, squash fans, and welcome again to Squash Radio. We have a great guest for you today. He is based out of Philadelphia, and he is someone who I think is completely fascinating and one of the most interesting people I've had the pleasure to meet. That is the one and only Dr. Drexel Zillmer, who is the athletic director and Carl R. Pacifico Professor of Neuropsychology at Drexel University. Dr. Zillmer has been a transformational force for Drexel Athletics. He's helped to drive excellence both within the department as well as for the student athletes achieving amazing results both on and off the field. On the academic side, he has published several books, one of which is called Military Psychology. But he has also published more than 100 journal articles and appears regularly on local and national media outlets covering a range of topics including sports psychology, neuropsychology, forensic psychology, and the psychology of terrorism. For his work on the military and understanding the psychology of terrorism, he has been one of the few civilians invited by the Pentagon as a distinguished visitor to go to Guantanamo Bay. But another great way to learn about Dr. Zillmer are the organizations and committees that he serves outside of his day job. They reflect his own diverse range of passions and interests, from sports, arts, culture activities, and civic duty. He serves on the executive board of the Philadelphia Sports Congress, the Philadelphia Classical Guitar Society, the International House of Philadelphia, the Austrian Society of Pennsylvania, advisory board member to the local urban program, Squash Marts, as well as serves on the Olympic Sports Liaison Committee between the NCAA and the USOC. Dr. Zillmer was born in Tokyo, Japan, raised in Europe, and is bilingual in English and German. He has a passion for arts and has exhibited work in Italy and Philadelphia. He studies and plays the classical guitar, but also produces events around the community. For sports, he enjoys golf, tennis, court tennis, and of course, squash. So I got to know Dr. Zillmer while I was working at US Squash as the event CEO of the US Open. We worked together as part of the team to turn the US Open into the great event it is today, with its unique venue layout, its fantastic on and off court programming, as well as it became the first squash tournament in history to offer parity in prize money for both men and women at the World Series level. In the extended version of this interview, you'll hear him talk about his trip to Guantanamo Bay, how he transitioned from being a psychology professor to the athletic director. But in this selected version, we cover the before and after picture of Drexel Athletics with Dr. Zillmer. We dive into the reasons for his success and how he approaches his leadership role. And naturally, we talk about squash and how Drexel built up its program, as well as Dr. Zillmer's thoughts on college squash and the NCAA. And of course, don't forget to stay tuned for the quickfire section of this program. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed having this conversation with Dr. Zillmer, and we hope you do too. So without further ado, here we go. All right there, squash fans. Well, we have a great guest for you today. It's Dr. Drexel Zillmer from Drexel University, and I want to welcome you to the show.
Thank you, Connor.
I'm so excited to do this interview because ever since I met you, you've been one of the more fascinating and unique people I've met in my life, and there's so many ways that I can back that up, but you know, you're one of the unique or few people in the world that has had a chance to visit Guantanamo Bay. And I wanted to kickstart it there and I think if people are interested in this, I recommend you going to ericzillmer.com, and he describes all of this in great detail. But, I'd like to hear from your perspective, kind of an overview of what drew you to this project and just what you kind of experienced there.
Yeah, Connor. Thank you. Look, I'm very interested as a psychologist in, when people engage in behaviors that are maladaptive, including terrorism. I'm interested in the perpetrators, what they're thinking, what are some of the social mechanisms that create those behaviors. And so I've been working in that space for a long time, terrorism and psychology of terrorists. And it's really been formed by having grown up overseas, where terrorism was more common in the 70s. I was at the Munich Olympics when terrorist or Red Army faction attacked the Olympic Village and took Israeli wrestlers hostage, and we all know how that ended. And it just was interesting to me. And my father was a West Point graduate, had a military career in intelligence. And because of that, I grew up all over the world, was born in Japan, lived in Europe, lived in different places. I just have this interesting perspective on different cultures and what motivates people to do what they do. And so I've got interested as a psychologist in understanding really the criminal mind, whether it's a murderer or a serial killer, or in this case, perpetrators of terrorism. And because of my work, the Department of Defense invited me to spend a day at Guantanamo and their facility there, where they, at the time when I visited, they had about 200 detainees there. And I was allowed to look at the interrogation procedures, talk to the interrogators, look at the facilities, what they call inside the wire. And of course, as you can imagine, I remember every minute of that day. I mean, you're basically in Cuba. When you land, they welcome you to free Cuba. And they were very cooperative. And I really believe that at the time when I visited, it's very much a military prison compared to some of the waterboarding and torture that took place, I would say, between 2002 and 2006. So that was an interesting visit. I don't remember seeing any squash courts. I did see a nine-hole golf course, which I would have to say is the worst golf course I've ever seen in my life. But there is a golf course in Guantanamo Bay. They ask you to water the green as you leave, to exit the green, and you bring a mat along to play from a mat, not from the grass. But, I've always tried to get into interesting spaces. And when I was introduced to U.S. squash, that was another interesting space for me to understand how that world works, because as you know, I grew up with sports, but I did not grow up with squash.
Can you talk a little bit about how you got notified that you would be accepted to be able to go down to visit Guantanamo Bay?
Yeah, I was sort of an independent contractor, as you know, I'm a professor. And at the time, I believe the Department of Defense was very interested in having anybody look at this objectively. They had such a bad PR about how they were managing Guantanamo. Mm-hmm. As you know, it's a political hot potato. It's, when you go to war, Connor, sometimes people need to think that through, and, you'll have prisoners of war, and you will not know where they came from. There won't be any eyewitnesses. It's very hard to use the kind of due process that we use in America, and that's why they're on foreign soil. They really don't have any rights. And be it as you may think about it, one way or another, that's what happens when you go to war, whether you're in a gulag or in a concentration camp, or in this case in Guantanamo Bay. So I received a letter inviting me, and of course I thought initially the letter might have been written by you or by somebody else as a joke, but I accepted, and it was a distinguished visitor trip. I was housed at Andrews Air Force Base. I was flown on a private jet down to Guantanamo, and I was given truly all access. And the military, they get misperceived a lot. Of course, they know what they're doing. It is a complicated situation, socially, politically, and militarily. But I wrote about it. I thought it was a very interesting day for me, and I thought it was a great opportunity to see what our government does to those that they find of what they call high-value prisoners, individuals that are involved at the time in Al-Qaeda terrorist operations, moving money, learning how to build bombs, creating a safe house infrastructure. Those were the detainees that were there. And it was really a crazy situation because there's a bunch of psychologists there that are trying to keep those detainees alive. Many have been there for 6-7 years at great cost to our government. Many of them are suicidal. Yet there's another group of psychologists, which is a very controversial topic, that help in the interrogation of these detainees, which since then has stopped or is at least is a really hot potato. If it's done, it's a secrecy. So I was sort of given access to all of that.
Wow.
They told me they're not going to spin anything. Of course, everything was spun right from the very beginning. But and the weirdest thing, Connor, is of course, I didn't take my cell phone. I didn't take a camera. But they gave me my own private cameraman, issued by the U.S. Navy. I go, that's interesting. And they gave me about 200 pictures. They were never with a wide angle, but it was interesting. I also have pictures that show some of the things that you see, what's called inside the wire, including an arrow on the prisoner's floor that points to Mecca with a number of something like 12,226 kilometers, just to tell them they're very far from home. Of course, they don't believe the arrow. They pray into their own direction.
Oh, is that right?
There's a lot of distrust between the detainees and those who protect them and also who incarcerate them. So it's a very complicated situation.
You gave a little bit of a reason why, or the terrorist attacks that happened at an early age for you, that created a lot of intrigue and fascination. But how'd you close that gap between what interested you and fascinated you towards becoming making this a field of your study?
Well, I've always been interested in it. My father was in World War II. I'm the product of a war marriage. My dad graduated West Point in 1944, went over and fought the war for a year in the European theater. After the war, he married my mother, an Austrian figure skater. My dad played baseball, football, and track and field at West Point, so I grew up in a sports family. And, of course, I was also interested in all the things that my father experienced, including he was part of the 42nd Rainbow Division that liberated Dachau concentration camp just outside of Munich. I always was interested in it, and it was a hobby. And I also went to German school, Connor, as an American, so I always wondered what the generation of fathers did of my friends in their Third Reich. Nobody wanted to talk about it. And so I just sort of sat on that until I came to the United States as a junior in college and finished graduate school, got my doctoral degree, and I really became an expert in the psychological assessment, including forensic assessments. So once I also had a skill to look at it, I found out, my first book that I published, I found out that over 200 psychological records were given to Third Reich war criminals, Nazis, from collaborators to those who were the architects of the Holocaust. So I found all of those records in Europe and all over the world, and I wrote my first book on those records called The Nazi Personality. So from there, when 9/11 happened, I was already working on terrorism for over 10 years. So it's something that I've worked on for a long time. I'm going to teach a course at Drexel in the next quarter called The Rise of ISIS. And if that's not the furthest thing on your mind from world-class professional squash, but I'll tell you what, sports is a great catalyst. And when I was on that plane going down to Guantanamo, they all looked at me like I'm a spy, which in a way I was.
Right.
They really couldn't control me or what I think. And I think the American educational system is such a beautiful thing because you're allowed to think whatever you want to think. Not that every thought is useful, but you're allowed to think things like maybe terrorists are normal, maybe they're dangerous. You can explore those ideas. And people looked at me kind of wary, but they looked at my bio and they also saw I was an athletic director. And
right.
We talked about sports. And so everybody went to school somewhere. Everybody's a fan of professional football. And sports just cuts across all those classes and ranks in the military. And it was a great way to break the ice and have a good relationship with these people who are really just doing their job, and they're trying to do it the best way they can in a very complicated environment.
I mean, talk a little bit about how you transitioned or, came to be the director of athletics at Drexel, because your background is all in psychology. And how did you make that transition? And obviously, you have a deep passion and roots for sports, but how did that come about?
So when I took the position at Drexel University, I was an assistant professor. I ran the first PhD program in neuropsychology, and that's something I really enjoyed. I felt the answer to understanding the meaning of life lies in the synapses of our brain, whether it's religion or hitting a volley on the squash court. And so that's why I took the job at Drexel. It was a great opportunity, and it was everything it shaped up to be. I was very happy. But, of course, I grew up in sports. My sister is an Olympic figure skater. My mom was a world-class figure skater. As you know, when sports is on in your household, somebody walks in, there's a game on the TV, and your parents go like, well, who's playing? Right. And it's a great way to grow up, I believe. Of course, I'm a proponent of sports because it cuts across ages and authorities, and it's a great way for a family to bond and talk to each other. And so I had this great experience, and I was more of an athlete that played a lot of different sports. My best sport was skiing, alpine skiing. We grew up in a small alpine village at the Olympic Training Center for figure skating, where my sister was skating for West Germany. And I was skiing every day, and I was very, very good, but I also was prone to injuries. I broke my leg twice, and so I tried basketball, I played tennis, I played club volleyball, I was the goalie for our varsity school team. So when I got to Drexel, I would go to the gym every day. And as I got to know people, like lunch ball, and just talk to the coaches with no real motivation to do anything formal, they started embracing me and said, hey, you want to be the faculty athletic representative, which is a person who oversees the academic integrity of all the student athletes in our varsity Division I program. So I said, sure. And as I worked in that role, I got to become friends with our then president, Taki Papadakis. And one day, on April 8th, 1998, I know the date because it kind of changed my life, Connor. I mean, they said, look, we're going to make a change in the athletic program, and we'd like you to be the athletic director. You got 5 minutes to make up your mind.
No way.
Now, mind you, that's how, Taki Papadakis was Greek American, and that's how they like to make decisions. And
right.
One has to understand, I was at the height of my intellectual career. I just published a major textbook on the brain that was used in over 500 universities across the world. I just got a named professorship. We just got our neuropsych program that I've been working on for 10 years, approved by the American Psychological Association as an accredited clinical psychology program. These are all things I worked on very hard. I was the president of our national organization. So all of these things came together in 1998, and I thought, I've accomplished all these things, and I think it's hard to being an aging professor at a university. So that's what I've done always in life, Connor, and I think that's what sports teaches you to be not surprised when you have an opportunity to live in the moment, to make decisions on the fly, to take risks. Those are all things that sports teaches you. So maybe because of my world and my life in sports, I said, this is a great opportunity. I'm going to go for this drop shot, and I'm either going to win the point or I'm going to lose. So I said, let's do it. Now, looking back, it's really not any different than being a senior vice president or being a high-level administrator. I mean, it's still in higher education. I still work at Drexel. I still have tenure, but that has been 19 years ago, and it's really one of the best decisions I've made. And I've always told my students, the most interesting people are those that don't know what are they going to do the next day. If you have a complete plan, a game plan, including in sports, you're not going to be able to succeed. If you're open to opportunity and challenges that you have, that are presented to you, and you listen. And I'm not saying everybody should be like me, but for me, if I would just not have listened, I would have said no. I would have been doing something different. But this has been a great opportunity, and all the things that you and I have been working on together to raise the level of awareness about professional squash and intercollegiate squash. It's been really a great journey.
Just to give some context, would you mind giving a kind of before Dr. Zillmer took over Director of Athletics almost 20 years ago now, and where it is, where it was then and where it is today?
Well, one of the things that I think I appreciate doing, and I know you well, I think you're the same, is to build things, to create things, to look into spaces that haven't been really explored, rather than managing and taking care of things. So when I took over athletics, it wasn't in great shape. That's why they were making a change. So at the time, really very few people cared about Drexel Athletics. We had a good basketball program, but that was just about it. We had a building with no windows. We raised $40,000 a year. We were playing local teams, and it was that kind of a situation. However, we were Division I, so the opportunity for us was really great to be something more than we were. And since then, we've joined a new conference with really great national schools like, the College of William and Mary, or the College of Charleston. We are playing now a national schedule. We just beat Oregon State in wrestling last week. We beat Georgetown in swimming just this week. We don't always win our matches, of course, but we try to play a national schedule. And we're trying to also excel at a national and even an international level. And so our wrestling team this year has been ranked top 25. As you know, our men's team in squash is ranked number 5 right now in the country, and our women number 13. Our women's basketball right now is number 1 in the ESPN mid-major poll, and our field hockey and lacrosse teams have always been a perennial top 20 contender. So, and we're raising now, between $2 and $4 million a year, and have over 2,000 donors. So we've come a long way.
Yeah, no, it's impressive. You've been the core driver of the athletics, and what do you credit your success or your focus on being able to accomplish that?
Well, I think 2 things, Connor, is the people you surround yourself with. And, you meet so many great people, interesting people skiing because you're sitting on a chairlift with them.
Yeah.
For 15 minutes, I met this person who was a CEO of a company called Computer Science Corporation, and that's a company with 120,000 employees. And I said, "What's your most difficult task you're dealing with day in, day out?" And he said, "People." So whether it's a really large company or whether it's something like an athletics department, you have to surround yourself with the right people. And I really believe that everybody who works for Drexel Athletics believes in what they do. They just do. They have a passion about it. And so I've also been working with the same people, many of them who for really 18, 19 years. We've been a team that's had a stability. The other thing I believe is leadership. We have a president at Drexel University, John Fry, who's just an amazing, creative, innovative, personable leader. And when you have good leadership, it allows you to be at peace with yourself and explore things that you're not afraid to explore. And so I think those 2 things are really, really important.
For you to be a leader to your department, what are some things that you try and do for your team to support them?
I think you have to be true to yourself. For myself, I'm a leader who likes to create a social environment. I'm not very good at organizing tasks. I hire people to do that. I'm not saying that's everybody should be like me, but I think you need to know your strengths and weaknesses when you're a leader. And of course, in psychology, we study leadership. We wonder whether you're born a leader, like Winston Churchill, or whether you can learn to be a leader, like these thousands of retreats that have, these business gurus come. I once went to one of them, and they had all these books like, First Break All the Rules, From Good to Better, or whatever. I go like, those are great books, but has anybody ever read War and Peace by Tolstoy? I mean, you can learn a lot about business from that book. I've always been going against the grain about just leadership by paint and numbers. I try to create a social environment where we're like a community, we're a family. We look out for each other. We have a passion. And I think that kind of chemistry is very, very important. It's hard to create because what you're creating is culture. It's the hardest thing. But if you think about some of the companies like Tesla, right now I happen to drive one, so I follow them. Or Apple, I would say maybe 10, 15 years ago. I mean, those are companies or now Google now, they create culture. Google, their primary culture is that you work in teams, that you don't have an ego, and that you have a global view of the world. I mean, I would subscribe to that. So that's the hardest thing to do is to create that culture, and you can't do it alone. You need all those people to help you. So when people say like, well, you've accomplished a lot, I don't really see it that way at all. I feel that, the people that work for me or work with me in sort of a horizontal fashion have accomplished all those things. Yeah. Because I let them.
Yeah, I mean, the subject of leadership to me is fascinating. And my wife actually, she works at Deloitte and does a lot of this as well. And, one of the things that really I've had to be, whether it's when I was the captain of my squash team, suddenly thrusted into those positions or being senior leadership at U.S. Squash, it was kind of daunting. And I wish I had had this advice when I was younger was, we always look towards other models for success. And I think what you just said really resonates with me in terms of being authentic to yourself and finding your own leadership style. And that kind of comes back to squash a little bit, where I really like the way Nick Matthew plays or Ramy Ashur. I can't play like that. So, finding your own style and taking parts from everyone else, but then building your own, I think is really, it's hard to do, but I think that's the best way of approaching it.
Well, look, Connor, you're a very unique person. The series that you're doing on Squash Radio is fantastic. And, we've been so lucky to have you be part of when we started the U.S. Open for men's and women's squash at Drexel and hosting it. We were so lucky to have you be our partner because I think you are very much like I am. You're like an artist and you see things in different ways and you take risks. And what you have created and what has really developed since then is, in my opinion, really a magnificent event. So a sporting event, international sporting event. It's been just fascinating to watch.
Well, a lot of that came down to you. And, this actually segues nicely into what I want to talk about next in terms of the impact that sports can have on community. And I think community can be interpreted both locally, whether it's Philadelphia, nationally, U.S., but then internationally. And I mean, talk about vision. And I think you know more than anyone the impact that sports can have on community. When you were looking for opportunities, what were you thinking in terms of maybe other sports or whatever? Like, how'd you come on drawing in big events to Philadelphia to kind of accomplish that?
Well, sports can be so interesting. And of course, if you were just a sports fan, you want to do something like football or something big. But that space is so occupied and so difficult to break into. I mean, just imagine, some of the biggest college football teams, Auburn, Albany, Penn State, how many years they worked at building their program. So you'd have to say, look, it's going to be really hard. We don't have a football program. So I've always felt that you have to be innovative and create something that maybe there's more room to excel because, for sports, I don't have a problem with just participating, having fun. But if you want to celebrate sports or celebrate really humanity, you want to look at it at the highest level. You want to see what's possible. How far can you push it and celebrate, pride through excellence in sports. So I really believe that sports at the highest level, including professional squash, is a whole other thing of viewing human behavior. And not every fan when at an Eagles-Dallas game in football thinks like me, right? They just want to have a cheesesteak, a beer, and beat Dallas. But when you look at the Olympics or you look at an NFL highlight reel, you do begin to see sports as art. And I'm really interested in that intersection. As it related to that, I took a little pilgrimage, and that's really what I thought of it, to Greece last year and visited Olympia, the original site of organized sports, which was founded in 1776 BC. And for over 500 years, they had the Olympics there every 4 years without an exception. You know how often we already missed the Olympics in the last 100 years? 1940, 1944. 1980, we boycotted. 1984, the Russians boycotted. I mean, for 500 years, they went every 4 years. And it really opened up my eyes for two reasons. One is nothing has changed. The stadium, the first original sports stadium, built for 40,000 spectators, looks exactly like a stadium you would see now. The angles, where the referees sit. They even have a tunnel, Connor, where the athletes come out as if they're born into life and introduced into this space. They have the original starting line for track events. You can still see it. It's made out of marble. And you can also see what's called Cheaters Row, where if you cheated, you'd have to pay a price, and then they would build like these little palaces that worship the gods. So it's called Cheaters Row. And so from the very beginning, you had spectators, you had athletes functioning at a high level, you had people who cheated. Interestingly, you could never find a rule book, ever. The Greeks didn't have very good language. As you know, they drew a lot on vases and things like that. And it's possible that there was no rule book, that people knew when they cheated, which is a really interesting idea in sports because if you worry about hitting the tin or you want to pick up the ball on second bounce, I would subscribe to you that whether you will report it or not is something different. But so that was kind of interesting that over 2,000 years ago, athletes really principally were exactly like they were. Now, coming back to your question, of course, it's a long answer, but when you have an opportunity to create new things, or put focus onto sports that are maybe not as mainstream, like lacrosse, who I believe has a great future in our country and is our only native sport, or field hockey, which is a little bit still regional. You can compete at the higher level. And so when U.S. Squash and my president, John Fry, came to me and said, could we use your facilities to host the U.S. Open, I was already living in that intersection of like taking chances on sports that are not necessarily mainstream, but are fascinating. So it didn't take me long to say let's go for it. Let's see what we can do.
Well, and that was 2011, and it was because it coincided with Drexel going from a club squash program to a varsity program. And I have to think that wasn't by coincidence. So when you guys started out, did you have the vision of being national champions? Is that the goal, or you want to just make sure that you guys were competing at the highest level?
It was just an opportunity. I started playing squash in the 1990s. I'm a competitive tennis player. But we had these courts, these North American courts at Drexel, and my department head played squash, and I said, let's play, because I can play tennis. How hard can it be, right? And he just whipped me. It was just, and because he was better than me, and because he was my authority figure, I challenged him, every week to a match. I don't think I ever beat him. And so I was introduced to squash, and it was very interesting to me. And then when I became athletic director, I kept playing. As you know, it's a great workout. It's just like so much fun. And then I always thought these squash courts that we have in the basement, and as you know from just traveling around the country, there's like all these relics, right? These North American squash courts. They're even in our league. And some of the universities, they use them for storage. And I always dreamed that one day we could convert them into something better. And then in 2001, we started Squash Smarts at Drexel. We had two wonderful women came to my office, and Lisa Stokes and Pam Endy, and they came and said, hey, we have this nonprofit, this community outreach program where sport is a catalyst for social change in inner city youth. And mind you, Connor, I get that every week, okay?
Right.
People want to use our facilities, and of course you want to help people as much as you can, but they made so much sense, and they were so elegant and charming. And I was thinking, God, I have these courts. I really don't use them very often. Why don't we start that? So we started Squash Marts in 2001. We got Lenfist to help us with some of the funding. Chase Lenfist, he's very generous. He's a squash player from Yale, as you know. Mm-hmm. And then over the years, we created this little culture of Squash Smarts. And what happened then is we had intramurals for the first time. And after 3-4 years, we had a club sport. This was all related to starting Squash Marts in this space with North American courts. And so by the time in 2011, we were talking about professional squash at Drexel and a varsity team. We've been playing club squash for 5 years and had Squash Marts for 11 or 10 years. So we were, so it would have been harder to go from 0 to 100 miles per hour in one day. But we were working on this for a while, but we never thought about making it varsity until we had the opportunity to do so with the leadership that we had at Drexel and the opportunity to host the U.S. Open. So then we jumped into this idea, and it just shows you sort of the process of creativity and taking advantage of a situation that presents yourself, because all of the things we've done since then have been just fantastic. So it was the right decision for our university and for our athletic department, and we've made so many friends, and we've been just, our program is 6 years old, and the other day we played I went to the match that we played against Yale at Drexel, and the place is packed. We have hundreds and hundreds of people watching this incredible match, and college squash is fantastic. Gosh, I wish I would just be plucked from my current job and put into some squash club at the age of 10 and start all over again. It would be so much fun. And It was amazing. And if you think that this culture was created within 6 years at this high level, it's hard to believe. So, it gives you a sense of pride and what's possible. And of course, we couldn't have done it without U.S. Squash and without my leadership at the university, specifically John Fry, who was an amazing leader and a very good squash player himself.
Speaking as an athletic director, and if you're talking to other athletic directors in there, because now Drexel has distinguished itself into an amazing squash program, what would you tell them in terms of why should our athletic department consider doing a squash program?
Yeah, it's a tough, I think it's a tough one. This is going on at the University of Virginia right now. I just visited their complex. It's beautiful. But, the interesting thing about Virginia is you see they're right next door to their tennis complex. Of course, I checked that out because I like to play tennis. And they won a national championship in 2015 in men's tennis, right? Which is an amazing accomplishment, okay?
Yeah. It
sounds easy,
unbelievable.
But to win a national championship is an amazing accomplishment. And so I think for a school that's already really well established, and by the way, Virginia is doing great. They have a great pro there, and I think the best is yet to come for them. But for a program like that, who is really, Virginia is one of the top 10 athletics departments in our country, and their goal is to be number one. I would say UCLA or Stanford might be at that right now. But for those kind of programs, what would you really add if you already are functioning at that kind of high level, right?
Yeah.
And then for programs that are more like what we call mid-majors, like in our conference, we're struggling with finances at every turn. So we're not thinking about adding sports. We want to compete in the sports that we have, and more isn't necessarily better. So I think it would take a really creative leap of faith to do something like squash, but I do think it is the right thing. I'm on the NCAA Olympic Liaison Committee, so I go to Colorado Springs as part of the Olympic Assembly and the meetings of the United States Olympic Committee. And my role is to help facilitate any of the 45 boards, they're called National Governing Bodies, NGBs, to see if there's anything in the college environment that restricts potential Olympians or Olympians from really doing what they need to do to win a medal. As you know, we won 121 medals in Rio of which 30 were won by student athletes and 80% former student athletes. And so as part of that meeting, I was given information about how many sports were added in the United States of America in the collegiate environment, and it's not more than 10, okay? And then you also see how many sports were cut, and there were about 20 cut. So there's actually the culture right now in intercollegiate athletics is to have less sports, not more sports, less sports because it's expensive and it's becoming ever more expensive to have high-level NCAA Division I sports. And so I think that's what you're going against. You're really swimming upstream. However, it's not impossible. I think in some cases it's the right thing to do. And I do think that for college squash, the best is yet to come and that more programs will see what is possible. But I hear that all the time, like, oh, look what they did at Drexel. Why don't we do that here? Well, you're saying that to somebody, a program that didn't have 10 years of squash, intramural club sport, squash march culture. It would be like a completely new sport, like saying to the University of Florida, let's start skiing. Yeah, so I think it's possible, but I think it is difficult.
Well, I think there are elements to draw on from the example of Drexel, and I do get asked this a fair amount, and I say, look, it's hard to go overnight. Most overnight or perceived overnight successes have a strong legacy of years of hard work and accomplishments before then, right? So I think to your point is find an inroad and start building a program in some capacity, be it, a strong club program or getting the faculty involved, or if you have courts, getting the students involved and, really bridging that gap. I completely agree. I think it's too much to go from 0 to 100. What has been accomplished is terrific. As part of this committee I told you about, I work with USA Archery, who's struggling to go from club sports to varsity status, or women's wrestling that's struggling or wants to go from club status to varsity status. And I think both sports will, and both are Olympic sports. And in both sports, America wins Olympic medals. In this case, squash is much more already defined as a collegiate sport. I will tell you this, Connor. Every ounce of sweat that I have put into college squash, my return of investment, my ROI has been phenomenal. And the fact that it's a global sport, with an international perspective, and that the students, the American students who come and play, are great kids from great families, I think it was a no-brainer. I believe it was one of the best decisions that we made collectively at Drexel University. And so, having said about all the challenges, for me, it was a great opportunity to build our program and to see remarkable kids from all over the world playing at a very high level against some of the best schools in our country. Yeah, I mean, headline news, Drexel University beats Yale. Drexel University beats UPenn, both 5-4 matches. I mean, those are nice notches to have under your belt for sure.
We're very lucky. We're very fortunate to have some great players. We very much respect those teams you mentioned. Because we respect them, we try to put forward our best effort. But just to be named with teams like that and play them to that level is really fascinating.
Right now, squash is not recognized as an NCAA sport. And, if we could kind of put out what do you think are some of the steps that as a sport we would need to do in order to close that gap, either on the men's side or the women's side?
It would be easier on the women's side. We still have Title IX issues as a sport organization with the NCAA, primarily because there's no equivalence to football. So you introduce men's football of 100 participants with 80 scholarships, roughly. You're going to have to find the equivalent culture for women. So it would be a lot easier on the women's side. Plus, the demographics are such that more and more women are going to college. And one way to measure Title IX is proportionality in participation. So on the women's side, it would be much better. And as you know, women's squash was an emerging sport for the NCAA. So I feel that some effort should be made, and I would be willing to participate in those efforts to put an application together to have women's squash be an NCAA emerging sport. And what would that do is it would legitimize squash, I think, for both men and women, because you have that in crew. The women are NCAA and the men are not. So it can create some tension, but I think it legitimizes squash for both sports. It gives you support from the organizational support from the NCAA. And it also gives you money. You get, every time you sponsor a team in the NCAA, you get a certain amount of money. So in men's basketball, it wouldn't be a lot of money because you spend so much money in basketball. But for squash, where the budgets aren't as high, I think it would make a difference. So let's say you have 40 teams that play or 30 teams that play women's squash at this level. It would be those 30 schools. You would invest that money you would get for the 30 schools back into the sport. And I think as you know, there's less women playing squash than men. And if you put the NCAA logo on women's squash, I think more girls would go into the sport because they can see the recognition that has been embraced by a very large, very successful sports organization, namely the NCAA. So I'm a complete proponent of this, and I'm trying to get other schools to think the way I do and to make this a reality. So I think that's something we could work. That would be the first step moving it into that direction. Having said that, I think the CSA and U.S. Squash is doing a great job in organizing squash at the highest level that they can.
I completely agree with that. And so what if we have some squash parents or even some squash players listening? Is there anything that the community can do to help this case, or is there anything we can ask or rally behind that you can think of?
Well, there's a couple of good signs. One is, we lost, women's squash lost. When we started squash, it was a few years before, it was still an NCAA emerging sport. You see, so I felt like, wow, that I could put that into in my umbrella of sports. I have 18 sports, of which 15 are NCAA. Men's crew, men's and women's squash are not. But since then, they reformed that committee because, Connor, it's kind of silly to have an emerging sport and then take that status away again, right?
Right.
So you would try to build it forward and build it out. So they reformed that committee. I think it's a very good committee and with very good objectives. And so to get that to happen, parents really have very little to do. It would be the universities that would support that. You would need at least 10 letters of support from different programs, and you need to have at least 20 to 30 of those programs in place right now, or have a very strong club sport culture. For women's intercollegiate squash, we have that. So we have that in place. So all you would need to do is do it if that's what the sport would want to do. So I believe that squash is already well on the way in terms of its organizational structure to accomplish that. But I don't believe that everybody's on the same page that this is one of their goals.
I'm eager to help in any way I can, and we couldn't be more fortunate as a sport to have someone like you, both in personality, but then leadership and vision involved, helping to drive that. So from the squash community, thank you very much for everything you've done. So just while we're on squash a little bit, I want to shift gears a little bit about the U.S. Open, and specifically an article that you wrote titled "The Psychology of the U.S. Open." And it has to be, I love reading squash articles, but this probably jumps up into my top 5, if not top 3. And so I encourage anyone listening to go check that out in Squash Magazine. I want to read one opening paragraph that really highlights why I love this article, but then, talk about, I had so much fun reading it. I want to hear how you came about writing it. So, the psychology of the U.S. Open. Squash at its core is physics and neuroscience. If there is one sport that is defined by the laws of Einstein and Newton, it has to be squash, where every shot celebrates the study of geometry. I love it. So tell me about writing this. And you also break it down into sections: ball play, the players, the game, sportsmanship, practice, and art. And I love what you do in the article is you toggle between both being a passionate player yourself, but then you talk about from being a professor, a PhD in psychology. So tell me how you came about writing this article and tell me more about it.
Well, Thank you, Connor. It was a great joy to write something about a sport that's so exciting. I would probably divide it into two areas. One is just the joy of writing. I've been, if you're a professor, especially in psychology, your currency is words. And so, as somebody who's bilingual and didn't grow up in this country, I felt I was really challenged in trying to be successful in a profession where everybody has a verbal IQ of 150. And so I really worked at writing. I mean, my father helped me, and then who has a master's in English. And then when I was in school, I always looked for a mentor. And I'm a great example that you can learn how to write if you put your mind to it. And so I've been writing for a long time. And so more recently, I've gotten away from writing esoteric journal articles and books to writing more things that seem more relevant for journals. And so I've been writing on mental health or on international recruiting. And I've been writing also a lot of opinion editorial pieces for newspapers, mostly on terrorism, but sometimes on sports. And I really enjoy that because you're trying to make something come alive, you're trying to connect with somebody, and you're trying to write it really in a non-academic way. So then I will turn to squash now. So when I'm watching, everything I wrote in that article is the absolute truth. I mean, I was just mesmerized with this event, which is really 20 yards from my office. So I would start basically living in this space upstairs and watching pros practice. I, of course, watched a lot of games. I got to know the referees. And after a couple of years, I got to know the players. As you know, two of those players, Nicky and Simon, the German and the Swiss champion, because I speak German, I became friends with them. I give them my condo. They can stay in Philly. I chauffeur them back and forth. And so I have an interesting perspective of this tournament. And so I thought I really want to capture that from a psychological perspective, because I can't write anything on squash. Technically, I'm not a good enough player. Recreationally, I once, I played with the CEO and president of squash, Kevin Clipstein. I said, Kevin, be honest with me. I'm going to give you my best shot, and then I want you to tell me if I'm an A player, a B player, or a C, or a D player. I hate to tell
what grade
Connor,
did you get?
I think, unfortunately, he's an honest man, and he said B. I was absolutely devastated. I was hoping I could be a B player, but I do have 2 trophies in squash, and they both say C on it, so it's probably it was probably calibrated. Well, it was calibrated.
Well, I think in that case,
president of U.S. Squash.
C could stand for champion, right?
Yeah, well, no, listen. I'm an average player. Let's face it. I know I am. So I thought, but there's something going on maybe that I can speak to that other people can't, which is the neuroscience of a high-level sport, the culture. I studied physics in Germany, so I do appreciate the geometry that you mentioned. I do actually believe that people watch all sports. The Super Bowl's coming up. When you make a pass or you punt the ball, I mean, people know when the trajectory is going to come down, or where it's just a reaffirmation of our existence or our physical laws. I also thought this, Connor. People come to watch squash, but maybe they're watching something bigger than just a ball game. And I really believe I captured in the article. I say it's a mixture of a Circus du Soleil act and a Spassky Fischer chess game in Reykjavik. I mean, it's art. I mean, there's more going on in this cubicle than just hitting a ball. And that's how I came about thinking I want to write this. Of course, I always overshoot. I was thinking I might write this for a really important, intellectual magazine, but I didn't really, where I would publish something like this. And I always write things without knowing where they're going to go, which people tell you is just the wrong thing to do. They say, what's your audience? But I have so much confidence in it. I thought it might go somewhere, so I started writing it. And then I have to give a lot of credit to the editor of Squash Magazine, James Sugg, and he said, look, I gave him the idea, and he says, if you write it, I'll take a look at it. And as you know, Jim is an amazing writer in his own right, so now the bar was set very high.
Yeah, right.
So I gave it everything I got, and I wrote this article that I think captures a different version. I would say a Jungian version of squash. Carl Jung was a psychologist, psychoanalyst, but he was really a philosopher. And what he talked about growing up in Zurich, that all these kind of behaviors, whether it's architecture or literature or art or squash play at the highest level, is an expression of humanity. He calls it, these are archetypes. And so I truly feel that this is true because every civilization, whether it's Greece or Rome or the Mayans or the Americans, they express their culture through sports. I mean, sports is really almost unnecessary, right? Why do we even have it? It doesn't really serve anything other than it serves a great thing, which is the fact that we're humans. And so I believe that nobody said that in squash. So I was trying to elevate squash to a higher level using this article. I don't know if I accomplished that or not, but I sure had a lot of fun, and I appreciated being published in the December issue of Squash Magazine.
The other thing that I was struck by was, and I'd like to know how this came about, was I think it just married the written word and also the visuals in it, the photographs, and there's a lot of them, are just so powerful. And did you help select those, or how did you come about with that?
Well, I just provided the writing, and the editorial staff did a great job editing it because I do have a German accent a little bit, and my sentences have a German sentence structure. But then, I've worked with articles like this for a long time, and I told Jim, look, just have fun with this. Take some risks in terms of like the layout. And I didn't want to be a control freak and have it like be passed by and I have to like look at it. I really felt that whatever that creative team does would add to my article, but only if I allow them to do their own thing. So I kind of learned this over the years, that when you're dealing with creative people, you just let them go. And certainly I trust Jim and his team. And they created a layout that I could not have created. So in a way, I was completely right. They just added to what I was trying to communicate in their wonderful layout of the pictures and the graphics, and made it very special. So I really appreciate that, and I think they really took that as a challenge, and I respect and applaud their creative process in doing so.
Yeah, like I said, it's definitely one of my top, I think, articles, period. One last topic to talk about before I want to move on to some kind of quick fire questions. But, I've had the privilege of working so closely with Drexel, with yourself, the team, and I really get to see a different perspective of Drexel, and where I use as an amazing example of how you can accomplish a vision. And one is setting it, but then two is going about accomplishing it. But one of the things, just to give some context to some audience members, is Drexel itself and how it's a little bit different from other schools in that it has a co-op program. And this is something I actually wish I had known about when I was going through college, because I completely believe in that system. And if you could just take a second and talk about how Drexel is different from other schools, and talking about where it's trying to go.
Well, Drexel, the reason I was attracted to Drexel, and I came from the University of Virginia at the time, which is a phenomenal institution, but I feel that institutions that have been very successful in the past play defense. They try to keep what they've accomplished, and that universities like Drexel that are innovative and that are creative play offense. And I certainly like to play on a team that tries to score a goal. And so I always felt being at a place like Drexel, a technological school, in principle, learning by doing, that focuses on innovation in a global context, has been the right place for me. Nobody says no at Drexel. You might have to find your own resources, but they go like, it's a good idea. Well, maybe we should try that. So it's been a great place to be innovative. And as it turns out, in 2017, Connor, what are you going to try to accomplish in higher education? Are you just going to teach these students a bunch of facts or a well laid out curriculum? Or are you going to teach them to solve the problems of tomorrow? So critical thinking, learning by doing, innovation, that's what's going to make people successful tomorrow. Pursuing your dreams, and so I'm really happy at Drexel intellectually. I teach in the honors program now, and it's a great, interesting program because they're not really tied to a curriculum. There's no curriculum in honors. All the students, of course, have majors, but the dean of the honors college, Paula Cohen, she said, Eric, we want you to teach the honors program, but you can teach anything you want. Think about that. I mean, it's a good question, really. It's really a good question for you, too. I mean, what would you teach, Connor, if you could teach anything you want? We'll get back to that later then.
No, I actually, I've given this a fair amount of thought because, for me, I struggled in academia, and part of the reason for that is if I don't understand why this is going to be useful, I don't like to waste my time. And I think when you're a student going through that, that was very cloudy and milky for me. Now in business and being kind of set free. I mean, just taking even this podcast, for example, I was like, oh my God, I can't wait to do this. I knew nothing of podcasting. Figure it out. So what I'd like to teach is how to, I guess, problem solving, creative thinking, and would be the two biggest things. And then stimulating curiosity. So that kind of like those three pillars and just cycling through that.
Yeah, I mean, stimulating curiosity, those are great words. I haven't used those words, but I will. Because, if you think that the question is more important than the answer, if you believe that implicit learning, learning that is sort of coincidental, is more important than explicit learning where you're giving a list of Latin words and now you have to memorize them, then I think you're creating an environment where students can feel they can take risks intellectually. It's safe for them. I'm not their teacher. I'm like one of them. I'm their peer, and we're going to go on a journey together. And it really doesn't matter what you teach. I mean, last year I taught a literature course for the first time in my life. This year I'm teaching a new course. I've never taught the rise of ISIS. I'm just trying to teach something interesting and use it as a catalyst for them to think critically. And I think the word that's going to be used in the next 10 years is adaptive intelligence. That's what we're trying to get students to, dip into. I mean, about emotional intelligence or social intelligence, even an older word. But the term adaptive intelligence comes out of the artificial intelligence community. And it really means that whatever the situation that you're going to be in, you're going to be able to solve it. But you're going to have the tools to do that. And those tools you can learn in college. So to be continued. I don't have all the answers. I'm just part of the process. But I think that's what Drexel. Coming back to your original question, I think Drexel does a really good job, Drexel University, in terms of creating this culture on a campus where the impossible might just be possible.
So I love what Drexel does in terms of it's a 5-year program. The first 2 years are basically teaching the core curriculum, but then the next 3 years are rotating between 6-month internships and then going back to studies. And that cycle kind of goes back to what I was just talking about and being fascinated by. And I really, talk about preparing these students for the job environment and getting that cycling back and forth. So if you wanted to learn squash, would you learn squash by reading about it? Or would you learn squash by doing it? Exactly.
And so we have over 12,000 co-op positions. And, we put our 92% of our student population has 2 6-month rotations. And they learn in the industry, how it works. And many of these kids then get also hired by those companies. So for those companies, it's a great way to have like an extended way of getting to know potential employees. In 2001, I started a program called Sports Management at Drexel. And if you think about sports management or learning the business of sports, which, of course, I learned on the ground running, right? But just think about you and I, we work in sports, and what if you actually could go to school for that? And what if you would have some time spent outside of the classroom, significant amount of time, where you actually get to, have to do something. So when we have the U.S. Open at Drexel, we have over 100 volunteers and over 25 majors, sports management majors, who help with the setup, tickets, and they may not be, like hitting balls with one of the pros, and they might be asked to clean the inside of the windows, because the squash players have this terrible habit of cleaning their hands on the windows, but they're being part of that culture. And so when they apply for a job, they actually live what the U.S. Open is, or any other event that we host.
Absolutely, and that's what I've had the privilege of working with a lot of different institutions, and I think Drexel's students themselves really stood out. And I'll give you a perfect example that highlights what you just said. Is there's a girl, Laurel Holly, originally from Philadelphia, transfer student from Coastal Carolina, and I saw her 1 year as a volunteer, and next year she was helping out the staff, a specific role. The next year, she was one of the key staffing roles at the U.S. Open, running all the programming. The following year, she's running special events programming and just took on more and more. Meanwhile, she is going through Drexel, right? And now I think U.S. Squash is so fortunate to have her on staff, and she's brings a already out of the gates just a wealth of experience that not many other people would have, and I think that is why she's very unique and special. I think that is kind of the story at Drexel. So couldn't help but take that moment. I think I lied. One closing topic, because I think this is just so core to where Drexel is going, is John Fry. And, you've been uniquely positioned to work so closely with him and talk a little about what you think, just talk about him and your impressions of John Fry.
Well, he's my boss, so it's great to work for a boss who has two really exceptional qualities. One is his personal qualities, and the other are his professional qualities. As a person, Connor, he's very sociable. You feel like you're talking to somebody who is in your foxhole all the time. And I can't think of anybody who is more fun to work for. On a professional level, he's just, a truly amazing person. There is no such game, but if there was a game where the rules were, you're sitting in a circle, and every person, when it's your turn, you have to think of a thought that's exceptionally large and altering, right? So you might say, one day I'm going to bring a professional squash tournament to Drexel and I'll be successful. And people go like, wow, that's really good. You get a lot of points for that. But when it's John Fry's turn, he would always win this game. His answer would be something like, well, I'm really reimagining how higher education is being delivered across the country. Or I'm redeveloping the urban landscape of Philadelphia. I'm moving the center of Philadelphia west to University City. You and I are not small thinkers, but those are kind of the kind of scale of thinking that you get when you're around John. And you're like I told you before, I'm a C player in squash, and in the game of life and in higher education, squash is a pro, and you're always playing at that level in terms of the speed of the ball and the tactics. So you got to be on your toes. So it's been a great ride, and he's been great for Drexel. He's been great for me personally. And I really enjoy what we're doing right now at Drexel.
As you were talking, I was actually making that same analogy of like both you and I can think visionary thinking, have had to lead people. And John Fry is just operating on a completely different plane, which is good. It gives me, I marvel at him in the way that he, I don't know how he does what he does. And talk about for Philadelphia, a $3.5 billion real estate deal. I mean, I wouldn't know where to start with that. I can run a U.S. Open championship, but it really is something to marvel at.
Well, listen, Connor, you're doing a great job here. You would win over me in that game as well. So you're a very insightful, interesting person, and I really believe that U.S. Squash is lucky to have you.
So I'd like to switch into just the closing part of this segment, and it's been so much fun, but this is just some quick fire questions, so you can be as quick or as long with your answers, but I just wanted to switch gears. So your favorite mode of transportation, what is it?
Well, I own two motorcycles, a Harley and a Vespa, and I would go with the Italian Vespa. Now, having said that, my Tesla is being charged right now in my garage, and it's having it's crying right now because I didn't mention it. It is an amazing automobile. But when you put it all together, I would take you on my Vespa if I would have to take you somewhere.
Well, I hope that's a promise. Favorite movie or documentary?
Yeah, just watched 13th. Everybody should watch it. It's a new documentary. I believe it's by Netflix on our prison system and the fact that we incarcerate 2% of our population. I love documentaries. Isn't real life always more interesting than fiction?
Mm-hmm. What is it something, either an activity or something physical, that has given you disproportionate happiness? Yeah,
music. I mean, I play guitar. I've been playing music all my life. I study the classical guitar. I produce guitar concerts. I would say differently. I would like to write a poem, Connor, and the title would be Things I've Never Regretted. And so what are some of the things that you've never regretted? And I've never regretted putting on a record. I've never regretted lighting a candle. I've never regretted opening a can of tennis balls. I've never regretted hitting, a squash ball. So, but in all of that, I would say music is just is an amazing medium of communication.
Completely agree. And one thing I'd have to tell the audience is also we're going to play some of your music at the end here, so stay tuned. Is there anything new that you're thinking of trying, and why?
Well, I love to travel, and I don't know if this is true for you. Have you ever, when you go to a really beautiful place, and the fact that we're able to travel like we do with modern aviation is just if you think about it, it's truly amazing and
mind blowing.
Yeah, in the 11th century, the average person wouldn't move further away from the place that they were born more than 3 miles. 3 miles. So they would live within a 3-mile radius their entire life, have a family, kids, live, get born, die. And, we travel so much and it's so exciting. And one of my biggest challenges is whether I want to go back to the place I just discovered or whether I want to go to a new place. And my answer always is I want to go to a new place. I find traveling to different cultures so inspiring. So I would say the answer is to travel to new destinations.
I like it. What is one of the most inspiring talks or pieces of video that you would recommend for someone that they could find on the web easily?
Malcolm Gladwell, the writer for the New Yorker magazine, who has many books out now. Outlier, Tipping Point, are a couple. He's so inspirational. What would you like?
David and Goliath. He's one of my favorite writers.
Yeah, exactly. And I got to meet him, and he was our keynote speaker at our American Psychological Association conference in Boston. And I've also seen him present at the University of Pennsylvania, and I invited my entire athletic department to come along because I truly believe, even though he's a pop psychologist, and by the way, he knows that, so he's not pretentious at all. He's really one of the most entertaining, interesting people.
Yeah.
But the idea of the tipping point, we discussed this as an athletic conference in the mid 2005 or so, and we really thought, we're right there. What do we need to do just push us over the edge. And Connor, 4 years later, within 4 years, VCU and George Mason, two schools in our conference, went to the Final Four in men's basketball, which, as you probably know, is the holy grail. And then this other book, Outliers, you should read it, because I think you're an outlier. And what he taught me, and I think that's the key for people to understand, is the advantage of disadvantage.
Mm-hmm.
Think about that. The idea that, like I was a failed athlete. I would lose more often than I would win. But because of all of that, it created resiliency in my life. And so in a way, it's an advantage to have gone through what I have gone, a career full of injuries and lost hopes and defeats, whereas my sister was a top 10 in the world. I'm not even top 10 at the local squash club. So, I would recommend him.
He's one of my favorite authors. I completely agree. He tackles seemingly uninteresting subjects and makes them completely fascinating. And to your point, David and Goliath really highlights that, of what is a perceived disadvantage. That it creates adversity, but then when people are able to overcome adversity, I mean, they are ahead of the pack. So
when you look at that book, of course, I read all of his books, and then David Goliath, he talks about, he actually did some research about David, the underdog. And he found out that when there's a clear underdog in a sporting event, 30% of the time, that underdog wins. Whereas you would think conceptually, the chances are probably 1%. Right?
1%, yeah.
Yeah, of course, they're not more than 50%. They're the underdog.
Yeah.
So I tell my teams, it's a great trick of sports psychology that if you're the underdog, you're at an advantage. And in other words, you want to be the underdog. Of course, you want to be the flat-out favorite, like Patriots are probably in Monday's Super Bowl, but
right.
You want to be the underdog. So it's a great. He uses sports as a metaphor for some of his analyses, which I also very much appreciate. He's a long distance runner. He's a marathon runner, and I think he has a passion for sports that comes out in his books as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. Next question: if you had to give a TED Talk, but the rules were you couldn't speak about something that you're known for, what would you want to go explore and then share?
Well, I don't know if I'm known for anything. I love the concept of the TED Talks in my class.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, I love writing, but boy, by the time a kid's 21 years old, and it's going to be hard to read all these papers. I have my kids, the students, do TED Talks in class.
Oh, no way.
Because that's their final project. Because I feel that they have to sort of emotionally embrace their topic. And I think it's going to be a lot more useful in their lives when they have to present an idea or a journey in front of a group or in front of a person or in a job interview. But the thing about, to answer your question, I've developed this great passion over the last 5 years where I'm a complete amateur at, and that would be gardening. And I just love taking care of plants. I think I love taking care of people. And I just have, I think you've been to my flat. I have all these plants and herbs. I just bought a greenhouse. I just love it. I love growing things. I love watering them. I try to learn about it. It's very complicated. When you go to a horticultural meeting, they talk Latin and Greek. That's not what I'm talking about. I look at it as like the source of life. And I would like to figure out a way to do a TED Talk about gardening, which I know nothing about, but not talk about it academically and intellectually, to truly talk about, what it is about growing something that makes you feel so special. And it's so beautiful. Plus, in some cases, you can also cook, eat it and cook, which, by the way, is my second passion, which I'm trying to learn more too. So it'd be cooking and gardening.
I like it. I too have recently got over the past 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Cooking has become an increased part of my life, and really, I was listening to this podcast, and a similar personality type to me, which is INTJ, described it pretty well. Is like there are so many long-term projects that we work on in life, yet cooking for me is kind of, it's a specific task, and you have to set your goal, but then what you want to try and accomplish. And then in the cooking process, sometimes, like you said, you have to adapt, oh, I made it too sweet. How do you counterbalance that? And, and then what I like is that within an hour or two, you have results, and they're fun to taste the results. And then you get to think about what you want to do next and improve. So anyway, that's my take on cooking. Last question. If you were to recommend any books about psychology for someone that wanted to get into it, and what would be your recommendation for an intro level, and then kind of the progression from that?
Well, I don't, even though I write academic books, I don't suggest anybody read them. I feel that was a way of
just even about the field. Yeah,
smart you are. So when I think about psychology now, I think of literature, Connor. I feel that literature is psychology, because you can only make characters come alive if you're really good at understanding human behavior. And so, if you want to learn about psychology as a primer, you can pick up any introduction to psychology book. I mean, they are well done encyclopedias about human behavior. But if you want to sit at the edge of your seat and talk and read about something that involves psychology, but they don't say it's psychology, I would recommend a book like The Chess Story by Stefan Zweig, Z-W-E-I-G, whose writings were the initiation for the Grand Budapest Hotel. And that book is only 90 pages long, and it's chock full of psychology. So, in fact, many biographers now say that Zweig, who was a friend of Sigmund Freud, was basically a psychologist, except he wrote literature. And so I really feel now at this part of my life, I love getting into literature and understanding human behavior through the lens of literature. And that's where I am right now. So I would recommend that book, or Death in Venice, Thomas Mann. Is a fascinating book, and as you may know, these two books are very short. As I get very, very busy, I don't recommend things like Moby Dick anymore. Like books like that, they take forever. But if you can capture something in 50, 60, 70 pages, or even a short story, I'm reading Hemingway's short stories right now. It's fascinating, and I believe, absolutely convinced, that that's the highest level of psychological introspection.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that Hemingway, he didn't study psychology, but he was an acute observer of human behavior. Acute, one of the best. And so when he writes about human behavior, it is from that perspective. So I see psychology in it completely, and so I feel that that's one way, or the best way, to get to understand human behavior, is to read about it, So I've gotten more away from the academic writings that we use to measure each other, how smart we are, to reading accounts of human behavior that are written by people who are truly introspective about the human condition.
I like it. Well, I'm so thankful for you being on the show and making time. And I could probably literally do this all day, and that wouldn't be fair to you or other people. But so I'm gonna wrap it up here. But again, I just want to thank you so much for your time, and also, on behalf of the sport. I mean, you really are a leader for the sport of squash and in sports in general. And so thank you for your time, and thank you for everything you do.
Connor, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Well, until next time, hopefully we can get you on sometime, maybe make this more routine, but really appreciate your time. So thank you, Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Connor.
Well, thank you so much for your time today and for joining us on Squash Radio. We hope you enjoyed this latest episode. But before you leave, we just have one quick last message. As you know, Squash Radio wants to help tell some of the best stories from Squash World. But in order to do that, we want and welcome your help. Do you know a person or a story that involves squash that is interesting, funny, moved you, you care about, reflects your passion for the sport, well, share it with us and let's try and get it out there on the air. You can email me at squashradio@gmail.com or reach out to us on social media. Again, thanks for your time and, well, until next time, be well and have fun.